When Ronald Reagan was first inaugurated in 1981, the end of the Cold War was not in sight. The Soviet Union had invaded Afghanistan, and Soviet spies were infiltrating the United States and our allies. During his 2 terms as president, Ronald Reagan took a stand against communism by publicly denouncing the Soviet Union and its aggression. However, Reagan would privately use his diplomatic power to persuade Soviet leader, Secretary General Mikhail Gorbachev to enact capitalist reforms, whose purpose was to bring the Soviet Union into the future. Ultimately, these reforms, which were designed to bring freedom to its economy and people, will be the downfall of the Soviet Union. Inaugurated after the decade of neglect of the 70s, Ronald Reagan inherited a lagging economy, the Iran hostage crisis, and the looming nuclear threat of the Soviet Union. Although the hostage crisis was resolved in the first few months of his term, Reagan would be faced with an ever-dangerous Cold War that he would address throughout his presidency. The day after his inauguration, Reagan held his first press conference as president, condemning the Soviet Union, even calling it an evil empire. And he stated how he would approach the USSR's growing threats. He stated,
"I know of no leader of the Soviet Union since the revolution, and including the present leadership, that has not more than once repeated in the various communist congresses they hold."
One of Reagan's strategies was to assist in an effort to have solidarity in Poland. Pope John Paul II and Reagan supported Lech Walesa and the Solidarity movement in Poland. This increased the unrest in the Soviet Union by setting an example for other satellite states in the Soviet Union that wanted to increase their freedoms. Another strategy was winning the arms race. Reagan felt that the Soviet Union was so defense-minded and paranoid about being attacked by the West.
He actually wanted to put a human face to things and engage on a very personal level, instead of just being diplomats talking past each other.
As the Soviet Union expanded their nuclear arsenal and innovated their military, Reagan thought it best to do the same. He wanted peace with the Soviet Union. However, Reagan knew negotiations from a defensive disadvantage would be difficult. So, Reagan persuaded the United States Congress to pass a budget that added trillions of US dollars for several future military innovations and expansions. Among these military expansions was the increase of US nuclear arsenals, opening military bases in Eastern Europe, and arming those bases with missiles. The greatest plan was the Strategic Defense Initiative, better known as Star Wars.
Let me share with you a vision of the future which offers hope. It is that we embark on a program to counter the awesome Soviet missile threat with measures that are defensive. Let us turn to the very strengths in technology that spawned our great industrial base and that have given us the quality of life we enjoy today. What if free people could live secure in the knowledge that their security did not rest upon the threat of instant U.S. retaliation to deter a Soviet attack, that we could intercept and destroy strategic ballistic missiles before they reached our own soil or that of our allies?
In 1986, Mikhail Gorbachev was appointed Secretary General to oversee the needed reforms and to end the arms race with the United States.
Gorbachev was cut from a completely different cloth than everybody else. All the previous leaders had all had the experience of either having been alive, either during the early times, even before World War II, had served in World War II, had a very institutionalized view of that the entire world was out to get them. I mean,
at first, Reagan was skeptical, stating in his journal, "Gorbachev will be just as tough as any of their leaders." And he would say, "We do not mistrust each other because we are armed. We're armed because we mistrust each other." However, Reagan's biggest ally in the Cold War and good friend, Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, also known as
the Iron Lady of the Western world.
The Iron Lady would take political heat from within her own country, but would help Reagan by meeting with Gorbachev. She would convince Reagan and the West that Gorbachev could be trusted. She stated in an interview, "I like Mr. Gorbachev. We can do business together." She took these steps because she had faith in Reagan, stating at his funeral, "Reagan sought to mend America's wounded spirit, to restore the strength of the free world, and to free the slaves of communism." With this private diplomatic trust established between Reagan and Gorbachev, peace talks could commence. The first meeting between the two leaders took place at the Geneva Summit in Switzerland. Reagan would use this meeting as a way to build trust with the new Soviet leader behind closed doors. Even though the meeting was bitter, he was able to build a friendly relationship with Gorbachev, and the first handshake signified a possible end to the Cold War. The second meeting between the two leaders took place in Reykjavik, Iceland. This meeting was intended to be small, but Gorbachev came to Reykjavik with big intentions. He wanted an agreement to eliminate half of the long-range nuclear weapons each nation possessed, both of which was a result to the arms race Reagan had implemented earlier in his presidency. Reagan declined the proposed agreement because the United States would have to stop the strategic defense initiative called Star Wars. According to the Reagan Foundation, the last thing Ronald Reagan would ever do would be to risk America's safety for the sake of an agreement. This rejection set a bitter mood between the countries. During nuclear negotiations, Reagan, Secretary George Shultz, Thatcher, and Gorbachev sent many letters. In these letters, the leaders talked about the breakdown of nuclear arsenals and ways to reform the Soviet Union. Also during nuclear negotiations, Reagan stood at the Brandenburg Gate and gave an iconic speech that would define the Reagan Doctrine.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
This public speech not only defined the Reagan Doctrine, but it encouraged the unification of East and West Germany. This speech was an example of his public stance while he privately used his diplomatic power to influence Gorbachev during nuclear negotiations. 1 year later, despite the bitter mood lingering from Reykjavik, the mood changed. The trust between the two countries remained strong, and Gorbachev came to Washington, D.C. to sign the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. This treaty diminished the nuclear threat of both countries, and the Strategic Defense Initiative stayed intact. This treaty also increased the relationship between the two countries, and the United States would begin to eliminate the mistrust it had towards the Soviet Union. This trust was apparent when Reagan went to Moscow, standing in Red Square saying, "The evil empire is a thing of the past." With the nuclear threat of the United States gone, Gorbachev still had to reverse the stagnating economy caused by the arms race, and unrest throughout the Soviet Union caused by decades of state rule. His approach was enacting two reforms. The first one was known as glasnost, meaning transparency. In the past, the Soviet government did not allow its citizens to speak out against the government, and arrested anyone who criticized its policies. Gorbachev instituted glasnost due to the unrest throughout the Soviet Union and its affiliated states. Glasnost would retire this practice of government suppression. Another aspect of the reform was allowing multi-candidate elections. These elections dramatically reduced the power of the Communist Party. The other reform was perestroika, which means restructuring. This reform decentralized government economic controls and encouraged enterprises to be self-financed, both of which were moves towards capitalism. With worsening poverty and living conditions, these reforms were not enough to undo decades of state rule and the intense stagnation that comes with a government-run economy, and several Soviet states demanded their independence. In response, Gorbachev negotiated a new form of Soviet government with the rest of the Union. These reforms would usher in the fall of the Berlin Wall. However, in response to these reforms, conservative and hard-line Communist Party leaders launched a coup d'etat to overthrow Gorbachev. Unable to hold the Soviet Union together, Gorbachev announced on Christmas Day 1991 that the Soviet Union had fallen. This event signified the end of the Cold War. By privately using his diplomatic power and taking a public stand, Reagan persuaded Mikhail Gorbachev to enact capitalist reforms, provide democratic freedoms for the Soviet people, and force the Soviet Union to address the failures of a communist government. Reagan's tactics also eliminated the mistrust with the Soviet Union that had existed from the end of World War II. Due to the Reagan Doctrine, the world saw the Iron Curtain lifted. The previously Soviet countries gained a future without communism, and the United States would become the world's sole superpower.